hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to yet another episode of Working Musicians Podcast, where I am your host, Dris Organica, and I am an animal. Today's episode is brought to you by Miller High Life. So long as it's $7 after tax for a 12-pack of bottles, I'll keep drinking it, and I'll keep saluting it. Speaking of salute, it's time to take a one-sip salute right about now. Good. All right. So, kind of getting back around to doing the podcast thing again. I'm just going to kind of update y'all a little bit on what's sort of been going on in my life and just a little satire on the times, so to speak. So I decided to talk about put Dris Organica's official stance on controversial issues. And I guess what kind of got me thinking about this is I was watching the presidential debate not too long ago, and I didn't quite make it all the way through. It's just like 2 hours. But I got through about an hour of it, and I think I've seen about enough, heard about enough. I was just getting a headache after it. I mean, good grief. Talk about South Park having it right. Giant douche versus a turd sandwich. I mean, take your pick. I mean, it was just such a debacle. I don't know. It's one of those things. It's like, if this were another country, I would think this was great. But unfortunately, it's not another country. This is ours. So it's just like, wow. And I don't know. I'm not really a big political person, but just my takeaway from this is, man, it sure seems like the people that we have running for the top seat in the country should probably be a little bit more poised and professional than this. I mean, good grief. If that's how things went on in like a board meeting, nothing would get done. I mean, it's just lunacy when I hear how this stuff goes. And I guess it's just a sign of the times. I'm sure it's never really been any better. I don't know. It just seems like it was much more amicable back in the past. I don't know. I've only been around long enough to experience a handful of presidential elections, but it just seems over the top, But at any rate, so after seeing that, I was thinking, well, what am I going to talk about on an episode? I need to get around to doing one. I'm finally on vacation. So, which on that mind, I'm going to take a stance on the controversial issues. And by controversial, they're not that big of a deal to me either way. But figured, hey, if it kind of gets the ball rolling, kind of gets us thinking about some of the stuff that there's a lot of arguments about in the musical world. And it kind of just got me thinking about it, just listening to the debate. But I want to just kind of give y'all an update what's going on with me a little bit. So forgive me, I haven't been on it quite as much as I should have been. Just life gets in the way. I did get promoted, and as a result, I haven't had a whole lot of time off. As in, there was about a month and a half span where I worked 100-hour weeks and didn't have a day off. So that's just kind of how that goes, But that's life. Things are getting better. So I've got me a few days off. I'm going to go ahead and try to get one or two more of these turds pushed out the chute, just so I can kind of stay on top of things. I did get around to putting out a couple more episodes that I had in the can. I got still a couple more in the can. I just need to polish those turds and once again get them through the chute. But they can be thrown in here and there. They don't have to be any particular order. But, I tell you, it's nice to be off, but it's just like, wow, you sure do get behind on things. Like, I've got so many songs that I've been working on. I've gotten in the pre-production. I'm just about done with the pre-production phase, and it's just like getting around to ever recording them for real just seems so unlikely to happen in the near future. Because it's like about the time you get a a good pre-production going, you run out of time. Then you don't practice something for about a month, several weeks. And then about the time, okay, I got some time to practice. Now you got to go buy new strings because everything's bad. Then you got to try to find time where the house is quiet, which for me is usually after the kids go to sleep, but kind of hard to do all that because, I do have a closet I can go into, but it's not ideal for recording like anything really in it. So been kind of working on trying to deaden that thing up so that I can at least do vocals and kind of go from there. But something else I did is kind of revamp my studio room, largely because I just kind of had to. And part of it was because I was dealing with stuff that just didn't seem to be working right. And I talk about, some of the gear I've got. One of them, I've got this piece of gear that's great when it works, but otherwise I've had so many issues with it. And I'm starting to wonder, maybe it's not technically the unit itself, right? So I moved it from one room to another and it stopped working. I'm not entirely sure why. I thought it was a power issue. So next thing you know, I unplug an old cabinet that had lights inside of it. I unplugged those lights and then the thing magically worked. Next thing you know, it stops working. Well, so I was fiddling around and I have this little like 7-pad digital drum set thing. It's really more of a toy, but it's kind of cool because you can use it as like a MIDI trigger so that you can, record a performance via MIDI and then put actual drum sounds, from your drum program. And so, it's kind of useful for that, but I never really used it. I just had it set up in case I ever needed it. And for whatever reason, I decided, let me go ahead and get rid of this. And I thought, well, now I've gotten rid of this, I'm going to try see if see what's going on with that DBX preamp of mine and see if I can get it working or try to see what the deal is. What do you know? It started working again. So what I think the issue was one, if not both things, either or. Either it was having issues with MIDI between I'm not sure if it's the cable, just the interaction between MIDI, SPDIF, and that little Yamaha digital drum rack thing, or whether just the power source was bad on that digital drum thing. But for whatever reason, it's working now. So that's awesome because it's just, I got this great new microphone and I've been wanting to, and then my good preamp dies. So I'm like, well, son of a bitch, that sucks. It seems like that's how life works. But, I got it taken out and I'm like, all right, it's recording right. Everything's good. So let me go ahead and get my whole setup, back together so I can, push mixes through it. And I have that as kind of like the core of my system. So I had to take it out to try to troubleshoot it and diagnose it. And I just was not successful until I finally realized what the problem was. And I still think it has to do with power. I'm fairly convinced that this DBX is just a little bit more susceptible to power issues. And it's not so much that the unit itself has power supply problems, but I think it, for whatever reason, tends to get interference more so from other things that do have ground or power issues. In this case, it was that Yamaha digital drum thing. So that's fine. You live, you learn, but it just sucks. I've been out of it for a while because I thought it didn't work. And what do you know, now it works. But now that I got it up and running, I started getting my setup going through and I pushed a few quick stem mixes through the system. I'm like, man, why am I getting so much distortion on my right side? After checking one cable after the next, replacing with another one, keep going down the list, checking this channel, checking that channel. Come to find out it was another DBX piece of gear. In all fairness, this was something that, some people might have just thrown away. It was one of their little 15 channel or 15 EQ graphic equalizers, and the right channel for whatever reason was just, if it got up at all in volume, it just crapped out and made a crunching noise. So simple solution, get rid of that. I wasn't too partial to it anyways. It was fine for doing some subtractive EQ before like using an outboard compressor. I would use it sometimes for just adding a little bit more of a certain section in parallel EQ, or just, maybe bringing in something a little bit after or cutting at the very end of a mix or something like that. I don't know. I used it occasionally, so not a big loss there. But once again, one more item that I had to troubleshoot. But the good news is I'm back up and running. Everything's working as far as I know. Knock on wood. And I will vape to that. All right. Blueberries. Nothing quite like beer and blueberries. All right, so I'm going to take a stand on some controversial issues. Since I was talking about gear, I'm going to talk about, I don't know. Let's talk about Behringer. Dun, dun, dun. So, for those of you who don't know, if you ever hear of the B word on audio forums, they're generally referring to Behringer. And Behringer really does have a bad rap out in the audio community, but the truth of the matter is there's kind of a reason why. For one thing, it's generally people who buy Behringer generally don't have very big budgets, and oftentimes with low budget people comes not a whole lot of knowledge on how to use stuff. So in addition to the Behringer units tending to be fairly cheaply made, they're also being used by people who don't always know what they're doing very well. So I'm sure, some of these people could use and abuse anything, but Behringer sure does get a bad name, and it's not hard to understand why. They cram a bunch of features in a box and slash the price. But is it necessarily a bad thing? Yeah, well, I gotta say, I've got 2 pieces of Behringer gear. None of them did I buy, in all fairness, but I've got a little Tapco mixer that I also use in parallel to my Sun mixer, mostly just as like for monitoring purposes. It's kind of convenient. That and my Sun mixing board doesn't have control room outs, and it's not stereo anything, so I do have to do a slight bit of routing. It doesn't actually go through preamps or anything like that. It's just basically auxiliary. And I use it to basically monitor different sections of a mix in different ways. I've got it set up to where if I'm mastering, I do this. If I want to hear what I'm recording in real time, before it hits the software and back out, I use it for that. Kind of like a headphone amplifier, and I just use it to route it between whether I'm mixing, recording, mastering, just listening to music. Depending on whether I'm doing a sending out stems or just want to hear the master bus. So it's convenient for that kind of stuff. Since it was made, much more recently than my Sun mixing board, it has a lot of features that the Sun just doesn't, and as a result, I use it for that. But I would kind of put it in the same category as Behringer. And this is kind of my piece on like the Behringer stuff. There are a few units out there that are great for what they are, right? So one of them, I think it's their 8-channel Spitif preamp and converters. It's one of those things where on its own it's only so useful, but when you connect it to like a let's say it's kind of like a Digimax or an Octapre, it basically allows you to add 8 channels to your interface, assuming you have Spitif outs and ins or whatever. There's been reports that, the thing actually outperforms some other very high-end converters, and I think it's crap. It colors the sound quite a bit compared to what the high-end ones do, which maybe it's better on some sources. It's just, it colors the sound. Generally speaking, that's not what most people want converters to do. They want them to not do anything to the sound, right? But people say, the converters aren't bad, the preamps are kind of lousy, but it's a great cheap way to add an extra 8 channels when you need it. At the end of the day, how good do your room mics need to be, or how great of a channel setup do you need to record the back of toms? So it's one of those things. It's great for when you need an extra 8 channels and you don't want to break the bank. At some point, how good does this stuff really need to be audio-wise? As long as it gets the signal there without degrading it too terribly. So that'd be an example of, where the kind of thing that Behringer does well is they give you something that will work for a very cheap price. Now, would I necessarily go buy one of their 2-channel preamps and use that as the center of my recording chain? Absolutely not. They're not going to be any better than what comes with your stock interface, which in fact they may even be worse. I don't know. They may be better, but I think they'll be about on the same page. So that's the kind of thing where I don't really get some of the products they make. It's like a cheap version of something we already have that's cheap. So why would we need it? It's not an upgrade. Oh, you put some tubes in there and a bunch of random features that don't sound good. Hey, if you have a knife, do you need a cheap Swiss Army knife that may or may not work? That's the kind of thing that they do that kind of pisses people off. And they do have a bit of a reputation for their stuff just not working. But it's, to me, they don't, if you get it and it works for a while, generally you're good. I'm kind of leery of their mixers because, at some point you start out with a 24 channel mixer. Next thing you know, it's an 18 channel. You can only turn half the panning pots one direction or another, and the EQ crackles. That kind of stuff happens, but that'll happen on any cheap manufactured mixing board. But I know a lot of their mixing boards get a bad rap, although their new X32 digital rack and console's getting pretty good reviews, so it's kind of turning the tide for them. But in all fairness, Behringer and Midas are now sleeping in the same bed, so maybe there's good things in store for us, because if Behringer's at the bottom of the barrel, if they're making a product that competes with Mackie and it's half the price, guess what? Mackie's got to get cheaper. Everybody's got to get cheaper. Now the problem is, in order to get cheaper, does that end up making the name brand's product quality suffer? I don't know. But at the very least, it's a win for the consumers, because it forces them to be a little bit more competitive with pricing and quality. So I think that's great that they exist. So the truth is, in my opinion, Behringer, it is what it is. I'm not going to say it's always good stuff, but you need stuff like that, because there's a lot of people who have random pieces of Behringer gear just because it does something that they need it to do. It may not do it well, but they just needed it to do something. Look, you need a DI box, you need phantom power, whatever it is. Who cares? I've got a little base DI box. I don't really care for it, but it does have a very beefy, warm, kind of a vintagey sound. It's good for about that and that about only. It's kind of like a little amp simulator. It's like their version of a Sans amp. Let's just say it does not compete, not even close, but it's a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the price. Would I recommend it? No. But in a pinch for $10, it's fine. It's fine for that. They make a little, I think it's a 4-channel like headphone amp. Is it especially loud? No. Is it especially quiet? No. But it's a headphone amp. It will allow people to be able to hear stuff on headphones. So for what they charge for this stuff, I mean, it's kind of like, it's great. However, if you're trying to use it to replicate high-end gear, it's not going to do that. It doesn't cost that much. So in my opinion, I think Behringer stuff is viable in the right instances. I think I'm glad that they're out there, and I think there's a reason why people hate them. But at the same time, there's a reason why they make so many products and sell so many products, because at some point, a lot of people just need something that'll do it. It's kind of like they make cheap interfaces. And actually, I'm kind of interested to see what some of their new interfaces would do. I'd like to see them progress a little bit, because they've got some interesting looking stuff, but I just don't know how good it sounds. But now that they're a part of Midas, I have the feeling their preamps might be getting a little bit better. So I'll definitely be keeping my ear low to the ground on that and see what I find out. But Behringer is one of those, I don't tend to buy their stuff, but the few things of theirs I have had, it works. I'm not going to say it's great, but for the money, it's like, this is awesome. Sweet. It's fine. So I'm not a Behringer hater at all. I wouldn't say I'm a Behringer fanboy, but I think their rap is a little bit unduly deserved, considering what you get for so little money. Okay, and so the next thing I'm going to talk about are plugins. Man, there's a lot of debate about plugins. A lot of people like to argue that the stock plugins are oftentimes just as good as the expensive ones, and the real expensive plugins are a waste of money, or they're far superior than the stock. And of course, this is subjective, and everyone's entitled to their opinion. But here's my stance on it. Sometimes it matters and sometimes it doesn't. But generally speaking, I can't help but kind of like a lot of the more expensive plugins, but my experience with them is kind of limited. I do have one of the major, I'm not going to say who it is, because there's some stuff on it I think is great and some stuff I really don't ever use, but I do have one of the major manufacturers, and I've got a few of their bundles. I'm just like, well, I'm just going to go with this and stick to it. Did some research, and enough professional people like it, so I went ahead and pulled the trigger on it right a long time ago. And I'm glad I did. I think, but now that I know what I know, I really could have gotten away with spending a lot less because I realized that there are other plug-in manufacturer companies that make stuff that have, where in my opinion, they have better plugins than specific ones in the bundle. But you'll find every bundle from every manufacturer, there's some hits and misses. But I will say that the expensive plugins do tend to get a lot of use on my machine. And the ones in particular that seem to get the most use from me that I tend to like, and maybe it's just, I'm not saying that's necessarily better, but this is the reason why I like some of the more expensive plugins, is because I like the plugins that emulate actual hardware gear. I know this is kind of a controversial issue because a lot of people say, oh, they don't sound as good as the actual gear, or they don't sound the same, and I'm sure they don't sound the same. In fact, I know for a fact a lot of these don't sound even close. However, if you've got something that's supposed to replicate some vintage, tube compressor, you have an idea of what it's going to sound like and what it's going to do to color your sound. And you have an idea of how it's supposed to operate. And so it kind of gives me little clues. Like if you have an API EQ plugin, you kind of know what it's going to do. If you have something that's an SSL compressor plugin, you know how it's supposed to be used and what its intentions are. And I like that it's got some, it's specific limitations. It's kind of set up to be, like you're actually using a piece of hardware. Now, in saying that, do they work as well as the hardware? No, they don't. But the great thing is, for $100, you can use it, 100 times on any song. There's no limitations to it other side that your computer can handle it. And my computer is anything but modern or current, and it handles these plugins just fine. So that's, I hate to say it, but the more expensive plugins, it's not always so much that they sound better; they're just easier to use because there's a lot of design elements that go into them, so that they're easier for the person just looking at it to kind of intuitively know what to do. And that's something I put a lot of value in, is if I can look at something and immediately know how it, how it should behave, then that's great. Now, in saying that, there are also some times where I think some of these guys take their plugins a little bit too far. Like, I don't think it's really necessary if you're trying to emulate an old, I don't know, Fairchild or some old kind of piece of rack gear. I don't think it's really necessary to put dents and scratches in it. And I think sometimes they make the little rotary controls too hard to use, considering that we're using mice and keyboards. So sometimes I think they take them too far. And I don't like it when they're too detailed visually, because that just is more strain on your computer. So that's something I don't like. But what I have noticed is that when you try to use the more expensive plugin packages, generally the plugins seem to they get the job done quicker. It's not that they necessarily do a better job, but for me, they tend to do a better job in less time. But there are some things that I don't think really are that important. Like if you just need something to do some subtractive EQ, I mean, any parametric EQ is fine. I find myself using whatever big name manufacturer is that I use because it's the first thing that pops up on the DirectX, plugin list. And all it does is it's just, and there's stock plugins. Every DAW has this, but it's just basically a parametric EQ with a gate and a compressor all combined to one. And I use that a lot just because I use it for, at the very least, I use it to put some high pass filtering on. So, and then a lot of times it's like, okay, this is this track, it has a lot of peaks and valleys, so I might put a little bit of light compression just to kind of tame the peaks a little bit, and that's fine. Or it's like, hey, there's a little bit of noise here, let me turn up the gate. And it's fine for that. Now, there are certain instances where, especially with the gates, where I found that the expensive program, I don't care for their gate as much. I don't think it works very good. I found that I use Reaper's gate. I think it's great. I think it's better than the two big name manufacturer gates that I have. Now I found that the big manufacturer's de-esser is better. I will say that. But I also found that the stock Reapers, what is it? I use a lot. They're, now I'm going to have to go click on it because I can't ever remember what is it called? They're Recomp. Man, I use that thing all the time. It's my go-to compressor when I'm looking for parallel compression. And that's primarily what I use it for. But I mean, it's just fantastic. It's got, all the stuff I need to, the parameters that I want, and it's displayed in a way that I like. Maybe it's not as sexy looking as some of the emulator plugins, but I think that's just a very easy way to do parallel compression. So that's primarily what I use it for. But once again, there's just a case in point where just because it's a stock plugin doesn't necessarily mean it's any better or worse. It's just you find that there's stuff that you like from every one of the plugin manufacturers. You'll find that, let's say you're a Pro Tools guy, you may hate half the plugins, but there's 4 of them that you're very fond of. Just because maybe they're not necessarily any better, you just like the way they work and you're accustomed to it, and that's fine. But I will say, especially with reverbs, there is something to be said about the higher priced plugins, and there is a reason why they come at a premium price in a lot of occasions. Now, at some point, every one of these big manufacturers is going to try to make a product to compete with the other ones. So sometimes it's a little bit hit and miss. Some people make a better this emulator, but their EQ's not as good, or this, that, the other thing. But the point is, all these guys make very good plugins. But I will say the big difference is just, a lot of it's just preference. But in my opinion, it seems like the expensive plugin packages tend to get better results a little bit easier. I guess that's about as fair a way to put it as possible. And another big point of contention between a lot of people is the whole mixing in the box versus mixing out the box, right? And oh man, can that be an ugly one? I mean, you just get up on the forums, you'll see how opinionated people can be. So that's fine, but what's my opinion? Well, simple. I think they both have their pros and cons. One of the big pros to inside the box mixing is that it's, in some ways, it's a lot easier. You don't have to set as much stuff up. You don't have to worry about signal degradation. You don't have to worry about a lot of setup stuff. And it's just flat out cheaper, You go drop, what is it, $60 on Reaper on a computer, get yourself some halfway decent monitoring, some halfway decent interface, and you're ready to roll. You can mix. And it's a great way to get into everything, but does it really compare to a full-scale high-end analog setup? No, I don't think it does. I don't think I think you're limiting yourself by just sticking inside the box, but at the same time, the same can be said about, oh, well, I only mix outside the box. Well, that's foolish. I think if that's what you're used to and you're good at it and that's what you've been doing for years and you've got it down to a science, that's fine. But to me, it's in order to really get take the full advantages from outside the box mixing, it takes a huge sum of money and time and effort to really capture every percentage point that really, in my opinion, blows outside of the box mixing out of inside the box. So on the high end, I mean, if you're to get the best plugins that you can possibly get, and then compare it to a all high end boutique analog setup, I think it's kind of hard to compare the two because they're just so different. But in theory, they all do the same things. But at the same time, I just find it very hard to believe that some program that emulates a Neve console is going to sound anywhere near as good as an actual Neve console, mixing through it that way. But at the same time, there's plenty of people making great mixes inside the box, and I think there's a lot of it has to do with what kind of artist you're working with, and the big thing is what the budget is. For me, I'm not gonna. If I go to a studio, I'm really not so worried about what kind of consoles and outboard gear they have. I'm more so worried, does the engineer know what they're doing? Do they have a decent recording chain? And after that, I don't really care. Does the room sound good? That's more important to me than anything. But yeah, I think for most people, a hybrid mixing approach is the best approach because you can allow it to take the best of both worlds. And the truth is to say, most of us do hybrid anyways because we're using DAWs. Very few of us are really out there still rocking analog tape and all that stuff. And there are people definitely out there, if you got one of those Studer tape reels or whatever they're called, it's becoming a dying art. But there are definitely a lot of people who prefer it. And I will be the first one to say I love the sound of analog tape. I think it's great. Do I really know how to use it? No. Do I have time or the patience or the means to really invest in it? No, I don't. So for me, digital is the only option. But I got to say, there is something to be said about getting outside the box and using actual knobs and faders and mixing boards and outboard compressors. As the analog equipment, I've noticed that if I apply 2 decibels of gain reduction, it makes a much bigger impact on analog gear than it does on digital. And for some reason, it seems like if I make EQ adjustments just on my mixing board, it just seems to work a lot quicker and easier. I don't know why, but it's just because of the way it handles sound. It just does it in a different way than digital does. And even though you still have to set up, take a couple extra minutes to route channels from your DAW into the analog world. It seems like once you take that one step, the mixing process for me goes a little bit smoother. But there are times when it really doesn't call for an outside the box mix, considering the gear I have. If I'm trying to go for something that's very pop and pristine and clean sounding, probably not going outside the box for that, unless I just need to add a certain something that the EQ on my mix board seems to do, or maybe pushing the headroom on the master faders on my analog board. It does a certain coloration to the sound, and sometimes that's very nice it's nice to have the option, but there's a lot of times it's just not necessary. A lot of stuff I do is, I hate to say it, but is mastering, and I tend to use inside the box for it. But there are some times when I hear stuff and it's just a mastering job, but it's just like, geez, it really needs to sound. It just sounds too clinical. It's almost too clean. It doesn't sound real. And just simply taking it and running it through some analog gear and just kind of messing with it a little bit, it's amazing how much life it can bring into it. So I think if you limit yourself to just doing inside the box mixing, you are really you're making it hard for yourself. Now, in saying that, there are plenty of times where I do straight up inside the box mixing and I'm fine with it. But I can't tell you how many times when just, geez, I'll do a mix inside the box and then I'll try to do it outside the box. And in all fairness, I already know the sound I'm going for, but it seems like I can just get there so much quicker, outside the box than I can inside the box. And I don't even have that much gear externally to use. It just, for whatever reason, that outboard compressor just seems to do a whole lot more magic than putting a bus compressor in a DAW for whatever reason. But so it's just for me to make my standpoint clear. I'm a fan of both, but in saying that you're a fan of both, you have to be able to say that there's something that analog does that digital just does not. At least when it comes to workflow, at the very least. And a lot of people have ditched their analog systems, and it makes sense. The recall thing is huge, and that's a totally understandable reason. However, if it's for my material, I tend to go outside the box. So I guess you could say I'm 60% outside the box in favor over 40% inside the box. So I'd like to say I'm in the middle. The truth is I'm not. I'm still a little bit more in favor for outside the box mixing. Okay, and so the final piece I'm going to touch on in Dris Organica's stance on the controversial issues is the DAW wars. Now, I'm going to say this is politically correct as possible at first, and it really is the truth. Whatever you're comfortable with is the best choice for you. However, I do have a very strong opinion on one DAW that I think really does reign king in so many ways, and that is Reaper. Holy crap. $60 for the personal, and what is it, like $200 if you're a commercial user, like if you have a studio or something, you're actually charging people. I mean, and heck, if you want to, you can even use it free. They're not going to come after you. They're just going to make you wait 5 seconds and ask you to purchase the program. And I really like their stance on this. Instead of you making you use iLock and all this, and added cost to the program to make all this, piracy prevention stuff, they have the program priced at a point where it's like, okay, I've been using this program for a year now. Clearly I like it. What's $60? You know what I mean? Thank you for making a great product. And I think that they, in this day and age of digital piracy, they've kind of got this thing figured out. They don't seem to have a whole lot of overhead, and therefore they're able to charge a very low price for a top, what is in my mind, a top-notch DAW. The thing is super lightweight. I mean, if you want to make it look like Pro Tools, you can. You can make it if you're a power user, you can make this thing operate exactly how you want. It's very customizable. But for someone like me, I mean, while I'm fairly proficient with it, I wouldn't call myself a power user. There's definitely some preferences I have, but just the way it's set up stock is, for the most part, very usable. I would say that it does leave a little bit in the way for intuitive editing. And I know that if more of my work came in the form of editing work, that I would definitely have to, step up my game and learn the program a little bit better. My editing is still a little slower than, people who really know what they're doing on it and do a lot of editing work. And it's just because of a lack of effort I've put into learning some of the shortcuts. But the ones I know the ones I do need to know, shift click, that makes a dot so I can, there is one thing I think is kind of, it's okay, is just the way their interface looks. I personally like it, but I could see why a lot of people don't, because it's very plain. It lights up just enough to make contrast. It's a lot of gray, black, and white. But the beauty of it is it takes very little resources. I mean, this thing renders fast and accurate. I've never had issues with rendering. The thing doesn't just crash on me. I don't ever update it. I don't even know what version I'm using. Wait, what is this? I'm using version 4. I think it's version 4 2.61 or something like that. I can't even read it because it's so small on my monitor. But I mean, holy crap! It is just, in my mind, the way to go. And I've used quite a few other different DAWs in the process. I've got a few others. Like I've got the PreSonus Studio One because I've got a lot of people I work with have it, so I've got it loaded so that, because half the time they're not very knowledgeable on this stuff, so they can just send me their tracks and all that stuff through Studio One, and I can just take it and export it out so I can manipulate it in Reaper like I would like to. So, PreSonus I'm sure it's very good. It's just, it doesn't operate as intuitively as I'd like it to. The program I really I kind of cut my teeth on was Cool Edit. And maybe it's just because it operates kind of similarly to Cool Edit. That's another one I used, that I used it quite a bit. Another one I used to use was Acid. I think was it Acid Pro or Acid by Sony? It was okay, but this is way better. I fart around with other people's Pro Tools, and okay, it's fine, but it's a resource hog. It's expensive, and Some of the stuff isn't as intuitive as I'd like it to be. Just to export something that's not in Pro Tools form is not very intuitive. That's a lot of the proprietary stuff, just getting things to work. I don't care for that. I've seen Logic, and I don't think it's all that logical to me. And those are the main ones I've kind of played around with. And I got to say, like, Reaper is just, there's no reason to change it. I mean, every time they update, new stuff comes available, and I'm sure it's great, but I haven't updated it, and the thing is rock solid, takes no resources. I mean, it's just flat out wonderful. And I think for somebody who's just getting started, or somebody who's really just doesn't want to have to spend $500 to upgrade to the next version, you know, sorry, Pro Tools, but I think Reaper's kind of got their foothold in that market. I think it is by far the best DAW, and it's only $60 to boot. So kind of hard to argue that. So if you want to know my stance on which DAW is the best, it's Reaper. However, if you're comfortable with Logic, use Logic. It'll do the job. If you're comfortable with Pro Tools, clearly it's a very good program. Otherwise, more people would not, it's the industry standard, which is the big reason why people use it. And they want to play nice with the other boys. But truth is, Reaper does a better job, and from what I've observed. And one of my favorite things is just how few resources it takes, very stable, and it renders so fast and without problems. So low cost, low maintenance, low fuss. It's one of those things that's, I never have to mess with it, and it just works. So that's great. Kind of hard to kind of change my opinion on that one. So that of the things I've talked about, I'd say that is definitely the one I have the most, I'm pretty stuck on it. Reaper, in my mind, is the best DAW, bar none. Alrighty, I think that's all I really feel like talking about. But I just wanted to, get back on the air and keep going. And I want to make sure you guys know I still love you. I still respect you. Bro. And I'll talk to y'all next time. Bye-bye.